my name is Emily Olson. I'm a senior editor with Moby Health News here for HIMSS TV. I'd like to introduce my guest. Can you tell me a little about yourself and your name?
Chris Boone. I'm the Vice President and Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at AbbVie.
Gotcha. So this has been a big year for pharmaceutical research and clinical outcomes.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how COVID has impacted your process and your thinking about clinical research and diversity there?
Yeah, I think that COVID has certainly has highlighted many of the challenges that we knew that have existed in clinical discovery and clinical development efforts. Certainly representative trials has been one of the more critical issues that we saw. You saw that even the regulators have intervened as far as expressing their strong desire to see more representation in trials. And what we mean by representation, we actually mean diversity, and that's in both gender and racial and geographic. And so we know that it's critical to understand sort of the treatment effects of many of these therapies on different subpopulations. And we're utilizing all the resources we can to better understand that.
Do you think there's been an increased push, and do you think there's been actual evidence as the years have gone on to get more diversity in clinical trials, or do you think that's something we're still working on?
Yeah, I think we've always, there's been so many studies as of late that have highlighted this issue around the lack of diversity in clinical trials, especially in populations that are disproportionately affected by any of those clinical conditions. There was a study recently that talked about prostate cancer, for example, and we know that African American men are disproportionately affected by that particular disease. Yet when you start looking at the actual clinical trials themselves, they represent a significantly less number of individuals, in the tune of less than 5% of representation in these clinical trials. So it's critical that we understand the sort of clinical benefit and the safety concerns with any of these therapies in these particular groups. And that could be racial groups, it could be age, it could be gender, it can be a number of demographic variables that we consider.
I guess, why do you think it's been such a big push, or why has it been such a problem to not have such a big diversity in clinical trials? You've seen studies where they're like, oh, there weren't any women in this trial. Now we don't know how it affects them. So why do you think that's been?
I think that it's been a matter of convenience because if you think about it, many of the clinical trial sites have been historically the same sites year in and year out. And I think that we've mostly seen in the U.S. especially, the clinical investigation sites usually take place at many of the leading research institutions around the world. What we're seeing now, what we know is that we have to find a way to connect better with our community-based hospitals so that we can diversify the population. Generally, if we're doing a clinical study in Boston, you can only recruit a certain type of patient there, and we know that the middle of America is an area that has not been accurately reflected or generally reflected in these studies, and that's something that we're working on.
Is there also a trust issue there as well, where some populations just don't want to be involved in a research or a clinical trial?
I think the trust issue has certainly has been a considerable issue, especially in many of these underserved populations where historically, there have been situations that have not necessitated or warranted the need to really trust. But it's something that we're actively working on. I think that having that sort of open dialogue, having that sort of transparency into the process and what we're really doing with these clinical studies is going to be critical. And we're doing everything from barbershop talks to speaking to church congregations to you're doing what we can to reach the people. And I can say as an industry for biopharmaceuticals, it's not something that we've done very well historically, but I do know that we're making that concerted effort now.
Yeah, and kind of moving on from misinformation and trust. Obviously, there's been
a lot of misinformation.
Oh yeah, there's been a huge issue with the COVID-19 vaccine where we have lower numbers than we'd really need to get.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's a problem. We're still here at this conference. We're all wearing masks, and it would be nice if we could move on a little bit from that. But so that's been a big issue. So what would you say in terms of speed of trials? Because that was one big issue with people say it's why they don't trust the COVID vaccine is because it seemed to pop up too quickly, and it seems to them like a year to put it out, and that's why they don't trust it.
Yeah, I think I can speak on behalf of many biopharmaceutical companies. On average, it takes anywhere from 12 to 15 years for these sort of clinical investigations and clinical studies to all the phases of a clinical trial to really be complete. We know that is a very long time. And it's anywhere in the tune of $2.5 to $3 billion, right? So it's a very expensive venture that doesn't always net out in an actual therapy hitting a pharmacy, right? But there are ways that we can slowly address that. I think we've learned a lot from the pandemic and how to accelerate many of those legacy processes that we have in sort of these clinical discovery efforts. And I think that hopefully we'll take many of those learnings and we'll apply them and institutionalize them, if you will, in our process going forward. But it does take an all-hands-on-deck approach.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about this before, that it's sort of a double-edged sword. You said that, we want these, therapies to be out there sooner so it doesn't take 15 years, but at the same time, if people don't trust it because it seemed too quick to them, how do we kind of bridge that gap?
Education. I think that now you see more people know more about the clinical trial process than they ever did before.
That's true.
So I think fully understanding the sort of rigor that's associated with the clinical trial process is very helpful to sort of the layman, if you will. They didn't necessarily have that sort of visibility into how these things were conducted and what exactly we were studying and why. I think with the assistance of many patient advocacy groups who are very, very, very educated on clinical trials and how they're run, I think that they're getting the message out that participation in clinical trials is critical, and we need people to better understand what they're signing up for, and because honestly, it's not just a recruitment issue; it's a retention challenge too. So you can get people in, and then they don't always complete the entirety of the study. So that can be a challenge as well.
Yeah, is there anything from a regulatory standpoint that could be changed that could improve this process or improve the trust there?
I actually think the regulators have been tremendous when it comes to sort of pushing the idea of representative trials. They've been tremendous as far as pushing the use of real-world evidence, which I think is another sort of key. Even the idea of these whole virtual trials, which we learned a lot about in the pandemic, which is leveraging all the digital technologies we have represented at this conference in order to reach audiences that we wouldn't typically reach in these sort of studies. And so I think so what I say is that the pandemic, what it did do, if there was a silver lining, it accelerated the adoption of many of these digital technologies, accelerated the idea of working hand in glove with all the sectors within healthcare, whether it be providers and patients and pharma and payers and so on and so forth, with a shared goal of really tackling this global pandemic. And so I really hope that when it comes to that issue of trust, that we've progressed at least in the pandemic, and folks can really see the critical nature that biopharmaceutical companies play in this whole healthcare ecosystem.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thank you.
And my name's Emily Olson. I'm the senior editor for Moby Health News for HIMSS TV. Thanks for watching.